In the early 20th century, China was in the midst of a brutal civil war. The country was in disarray. To make things worse, the Japanese Empire invaded China. Among the aggressions, the Chongqing bombing was one of the most merciless and ruthless attacks on Chinese soil. However, this historical event allowed for the temporary unification of China, the elevation of social status for women, and contributed to the victory of the Allies in World War II. On July 7, 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge clash in Beiping, China, between the Imperial Japanese Army and China's National Revolutionary Army marked the prelude to the Pacific side of World War II. 4 months later, China lost the Songhu battle in Shanghai. The capital, Nanjing, was in crisis. Therefore, the newborn Republic of China moved to a city named Chongqing, who embraced more than 1 million refugees, served as the wartime capital of China, advocated the Anti-Fascist League, and fought with the allies of World War II. The Chinese social structure and the world's political map changed. On the Japanese side, the invasions were draining the resources of their treasury. But the distance, logistical, and geographical constraints of Chongqing barricaded the mass expansion. Influenced by Italian air power theorist Giulio Douhet, in February of 1938, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters authorized the Imperial Army Air Service and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service to conduct the terror bombing. In December, to quickly remove Chongqing, the major barrier, it was mentioned in commands that the Air Force will direct our main attack force to the bombing of the urban zone of Chongqing and shake the Jiang regime from the sky and on the ground. In the first major bombing campaigns of May 3rd and 4th in 1939, the raids killed more than 5,000 civilians. According to the memoir by Ding Rongcan, the Chongqing Air Defense Command, Japan targeted non-military places such as residential areas, schools, hospitals, and embassies with both explosive and burning bombs, causing large wooden structures to catch fire in the explosions. Next year, from May 18th to September 4th, more intensified and record-breaking carpet bombings took place. Time magazine correspondent Theodore H. White reported it as,
I could hear screaming in the back alleys. Several times I saw people dart out of the slope alleyways into the main street, their clothes on fire, then roll over and over again to put out the fires.
One of the most devastating incidents occurred on the 5th of June in 1941, when the Japanese flew more than 20 sorties, bombing the city for 5 hours. Thousands of residents who hid in tunnels were asphyxiated. According to files from the Japanese government, Japanese squadrons initially met fearless resistance from the Chinese Air Force. But the Mitsubishi A6M-0, designed by Jiro Horikoshi, defeated the Chinese Air Force easily once it was deployed in Chongqing's Bishan battle.
Japanese fighter plane. Very fast, very maneuverable, but they didn't protect the pilot nor the gas tanks from bullets.
From then on, the Chinese Air Force would retreat whenever the Zero arrived. In front of the wide military disparities, Jingwei Wang, the former premier of the Republic of China, said that
we will definitely lose if we fight back.
He abandoned Chongqing in December of 1938 and collaborated with the Japanese. Bai Li Jiang, the Chinese military strategist, believed that
when there are barriers, there will be breakthroughs.
In his book, The Theory of National Defense, he stated that
the people instead of noble emperors are the fundamental base. As long as we use national self-defense to defend the country, we will win.
His guidance effectively directed China to penetrate the encumbrances and crack them in phases. In the Nanjing Massacre, Japan slaughtered over 200,000 surrendered civilians and raped more than 20,000 local women. Thousands of women were enslaved in brothels, and 90% of these comfort women had died. Knowing that fighting to the end was the only way to possibly win this war, over 50,000 Chongqing civilians, including housewives and children, volunteered as monitoring teams. Once Japanese aircraft took off from the Wuhan airport, the message would be passed along the route by telephone, notes, running, and even shouting to defense centers. Then, 3 colored balloons would be raised high to warn the public. Firefighters, ambulances, and medical staff would line up at the most vulnerable places for rescues. This national calamity tightly united the efforts from divided warlords, women and men, minorities, and the Chinese Nationalist Party and the Communist Party.
重要就是当时的中国，那么它是在抗日民族统一战线的这样一个旗帜之下，把国内的各大政治力量团结起来的。不管是之前水火不容的国民党、共产党、国共两党，那么打了10年内战，那么在这个抗战期间，在重庆，那么结成了这个国共合作的这样一个友好的基础，还有更广泛的民主党派。
However, the Civil War resumed with the Japanese defeat in 1945. After the revocation of external force, their broken status didn't last long due to a lack of motivation from inside. Nonetheless, the long-lasting manifestation among all could be women's social status. In the late 19th century, several Chinese women spoke out against the traditions of female inferiority in foot binding, but with little to no avail. These traditions changed when the Chongqing women had to rush to tunnels and hide with strangers for 5.5 years. When starvation and inflation became serious, women took over jobs to support the family. To protect thousands of war orphans, female leaders founded a borderless youth conservation society in 1938. In October of 1939, Chen Yi, a Chinese governor and the representative of patriarchy, published an article entitled "My Ideal Country" to urge women to go back home. He also banned them from work. This did not discourage Chinese women, but sparked off even more desires for equality. In 1943, the Chongqing women's community successfully initiated a donation for 13 airplanes. From the victim to the combatant, Chinese women played a vigorous role to change their fates, save the homeland, and obtain rights later in the Chinese Constitution till now.
Now remains for you, the present representatives of the American people, to point the way to win the war.
Even a Japanese female writer, Midorikawa Aiko, praised Chinese women for creating historical facts and adding glory to the women's movement. Near the end of Japan's air raids, General Kinoshita, the Japanese commander of the 3rd Flight Group, put forward the theory of the uselessness of Chongqing's critical strike on September 3, 1941, implicating the failure of the bombing campaign. On December 7th, Japan launched a preemptive strike against the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Chongqing hosted the first international military meeting on December 23, 1941, with representatives from the United States and the United Kingdom, who adopted the preliminary plan for joint military operations. To keep the Allies' supply lines open, Chongqing, as the Far East Command Center, were heavily committed to fighting and forced the capitulations of the Japanese armies in Burma. The last record of the Chongqing bombing was on December 19, 1944, with 151 bombs. When Japan surrendered in 1945, it was marked as the first and the most extraordinary victory in China's modern history. China became a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. In a scroll sent by President Roosevelt, he eulogized as
a symbol of our admiration for its brave men, women, and children. Under blasts of terror from the air, even in the days before the world at large had known this horror, Chongqing and its people held out firm and unconquered. They proved gloriously that terrorism cannot destroy the spirit of people determined to be free.